Let's bring in former U.S. Comptroller General David Walker. David, what should be the top issue on the debate stage tonight, in your opinion?
Dagan, despite what happened in Indonesia overnight, and despite the fact that South Carolina is, a very significant state from the standpoint of national security, I think we have to focus on the economy and domestic issues. The simple truth is, if you don't keep your economy strong, then your national security and your foreign policy will suffer over time. So I'm hoping that what we'll see is that we'll see people addressing things like, how are you going to grow the economy and generate jobs? How are you going to put our finances in order? How are you going to assure Social Security and Medicare solvency? What are you going to do to deal with the growing gaps in so many different dimensions between the haves and the have-nots in America? As was mentioned previously, this is part of the issue with regard to terrorism. There are economic realities that have to be addressed. We need to make sure that we don't allow those kinds of things to happen here.
David, a lot of the Republicans are at least centerpieces to them reviving the economy is tax reform. But is there enough daylight between all the different plans to really use that as a standout issue in the debate tonight?
No. In my view, there's no question that we need comprehensive tax reform that, among other things, that will make the tax code simpler, fairer, more competitive, and ultimately generate more revenues, not just through economic growth, but otherwise. But that's not enough. We need to also be able to understand what are we going to do to reform social insurance programs, how are we going to rationalize our defense posture, what are we going to do to separate the wheat from the chaff between which programs work and which ones don't work. For example, in December there was a major tax bill and spending bill that was passed that, quite frankly, no matter what you think about the individual provisions, will add $2 to $4 trillion in new debt to the United States over the next 20 years, above and beyond where we already were, depending upon the assumptions that you use. We've got to start looking more comprehensively in a more integrated fashion, and we have to focus on the bottom line. And what matters there is debt as a percentage of the economy.
David, what do you say the average American person that hears numbers like $20 trillion of debt, they find it to be incomprehensible and they don't see any way out of it, meaning that we're going to just end up running off the cliff, possibly ending up like Greece, something like that? What do you say to them about the future for their grandchildren and great-grandchildren?
Sure. Well, it's an excellent point. First, you have to translate those numbers into per person, per household, so that they have more meaning for the individual. The bottom line is this: it is not too late to put our finances in order and to be able to create a better future. For the first time in the history of this country, a majority of Americans believe that life may not be as good for their children and grandchildren. That is downright un-American. It doesn't have to be that way. Here's the good news. Yes.
On that note, David, I want to bring in Steve Moore. But, Steve, I have said this time and again. You have the 10-year Treasury back at close to 2%. The U.S. government can borrow at about 2% a year over 10 years. And until that changes, until it becomes a real strain on Uncle Sam to borrow, not a doggone thing is going to be done about the national debt until maybe it's too late.
Well, that's the problem. By the way, you know how many zeros there are in a trillion? There are 12. I know you know the answer.
I probably should know, but
it gets to your point. There are 12 zeros in a trillion. So a trillion is $1 million. Most people can't tell the difference between a million, a billion, and a trillion. These are big numbers. I just did a sensitivity analysis about how vulnerable we are on this debt, which is now, what, $18.9 trillion. And here is my greatest fear, and I wonder if David agrees with this. Those rates are so low right now, Dagan, that's the only thing that's really carrying us forward. If we have a return to normalcy on interest rates, so if our interest rates go up 200 or 300 basis points, would still be the
4%,
average.
5%.
Yeah, you're talking about adding another, every time we raise the interest rate by 1 percentage point, it's another $1 trillion of debt over the next 10 years. So, David, my concern is we get into this cycle where the interest rates start to rise, and more of what we're spending our tax dollars on is just to finance this debt rather than to get the things we want: roads, bridges, Social Security, health care, and things like that. And I wonder if you share that concern.
Steve, I do share that concern. The fact of the matter is, if you look at the Congressional Budget Office projections over the next 10 to 20 years, they expect that there will be some return to normalcy. Not the average for what we've seen over the last several decades, but obviously higher than what we have now. They expect that the fastest growing expense in the federal budget will be interest. Right. And what do you get for interest?
Exactly.
Nothing. And that's the issue, okay? We've been, there have been a number of reasons why interest rates are so low right now, but we're not exempt from the laws of prudent finance. And we have to recognize that reality and start doing something about it.
David, great to talk to you about this as always. David Walker, let's see if it's a breakout issue tonight in the debate. Let's hope so. David Walker, thanks again.
Good. Sounds great. Thank you. Bye-bye.